Hi, I'm Caroline, and I've created a lot of things, but mostly I've created a life I love. Join me on my journey as a podcaster, business owner, and mom as I try to create all the things. Welcome to the Caroline Creates podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Caroline Creates podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you for listening and supporting my little corner of the podcasting world. Today, I am going to dive into music, intros, and branding. So these are some really important components of a podcast, and I think most of you are probably at-home podcasters who are either doing this yourself, or maybe you have somebody helping you out. Maybe I'm helping you out. But, it can be really daunting to figure out, okay, what is supposed to be in my podcast? What components do I need? What is my music supposed to be? And oh, by the way, I have to have a cover art designed. I either have to do it myself or hire that out. It just feels like there's a lot. And so I wanted to kind of break these three things down. I do think they kind of go together and work together. And I'll talk a little bit about that. First, I want to start with music because it's the most fun thing to start with, right? I love finding music for podcasts. I think it's so fun. Music is super important because it helps set the tone and the mood for your podcast, which may not seem super important to you, but I want you to think about the person who's kind of going through podcasts, and if they click on a certain, I don't know, maybe they want to listen to a podcast about knitting and they click on a podcast and then it's like heavy metal rock music to start. It might be a real turnoff, unless of course it's an alternative knitting podcast, and then that would make a lot of sense. But you see how that can kind of play into the type of podcast you have and the feel that you want people to get when they start listening to your podcast. I really like to think about a mood or genre that I would apply to my podcast. What are those feelings, that I want people to feel? So if I want them to feel kind of chill and calm, then I want music that's going to go with that, right? So you can actually search on some sites for music that by mood or genre. And you always want to look for royalty-free music because otherwise you'll have to pay every time you play it. But yeah, I love the sites where you can search by mood or genre because I can literally, let's say I want upbeat pop music for my podcast. So I can search for upbeat pop. I can even search for things like happy and clapping and things like that. And then I can listen to a bunch, download some samples, maybe put them with an intro that I've recorded and see if that is the feeling that I want to get. I do this with my clients. We'll usually start with around 5 samples. And I've even had it, sometimes happen where we've downloaded 5 samples and then gone in a completely different direction because after listening to the samples of music with the intro, we realized that really isn't the feel that we were wanting to have. So it's all part of a process. It's not something that, you have to rush. You don't have to feel like it has to happen right away, but definitely take the time to kind of look for something that really is going to suit the brand of your podcast. Now, music goes with the intro. So let's talk a little bit about that intro and what that should be. I think intros can get way overcomplicated. I think some people like to pack in their full bios into an intro, and it's not necessarily helpful, right? I know that I don't want to turn on a podcast and have to listen to a 1-minute-long intro before we get into the content. Intros are really there to help the listener get acquainted to the podcast before diving in. So it really needs to be short and sweet, a quick elevator pitch. Who are you and what is your podcast about? Again, it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be super detailed. Just a little bit of information is all you need. Side note, I left my door open while recording this today, and of course my cat has decided to pay me a visit, so you might hear some kitty cat noises in the background. So I like to stick with kind of around, 30 seconds I feel like is my sweet spot, including music. I usually like to have the music complement the intro in a way where they're to the beat together, or maybe there's a spot in the music that kind of signals an entrance of some kind, and that's where I'll put the intro. But I do like to keep it short and sweet. It doesn't need to be a novel. It doesn't need to be a full bio. That's really like what the welcome episode of your podcast is for, episode 1, which if somebody is super interested, they'll go back and listen to that and start at the beginning. And so I just really don't feel like you need to pack all that in to an intro. Short and sweet. Now I want to talk about cover art a little bit. So I really do think of like the music and the intro as part of the branding. And the other thing that is a really important part of your podcast as a brand is the cover art, right? That's mainly what we're talking about here when we're talking about branding. Unless, of course, you're working on a website and then you'll have some other components. But for most of us, that cover art is kind of the really important thing. The first thing I like people to do is go and look at the category that they want their podcast to be in. And this can be on any platform, but I think it's really important to see what kind of visuals are happening in the category before you think about throwing your visual in there as well. And then I also want you to think about, as you're designing that square, what is it going to look like on the search platforms? Is it going to be easy to see? Are people going to have trouble reading the text? Does it seem like in your category people are using a lot of blue? Or does it seem like in your category people are using a lot of headshots, with like a black background and some white text? You will kind of see trends as you look around. Is there anything you can do to stand out? Or think about how your square will fit in with that. For instance, I was working with a client. We were designing her cover art, or she had a designer who was working on it. And she sent me over the first mock-up. And I said, you know what, let me throw this up. And so I kind of mocked it up, like put it in an image of like other squares so we could see what it would look like. And it just kind of disappeared and faded into all the other squares because her background was white. And I was like, we really need something to anchor this. And so we did a nice border that looked really good. That's what I'm talking about when thinking about how that square is going to look. For our podcast, Creative Biz Rebellion, we use a lot of color because we want it to stand out. And we really did achieve that with our cover art. Same goes for, the Caroline Creates podcast cover art. It's very colorful. I try to do some unique colors. That way it would really pop in the different platforms. So really think about that. Now, okay, so we've got these 3 individual components. We've got music, intro, and cover art. But how do they go together as a whole? Does your intro music make sense with your cover art? Does your cover art make sense with your music and your intro? These are all small pieces that tell a story about your podcast that are going to give away pretty important first impressions. Are they giving the right first impression? Is it conveying the message that you want it to convey? And a little bit of encouragement. I don't want you to feel like you have to get all this hammered down and perfect before you launch your podcast. Absolutely, it does not have to stay the same. You can update your intro music later. You can decide that your cover art needs to look a little different later. None of it is set in stone. And I think that's what's really important. Like, as your podcast evolves and grows, so will the brand of your podcast change. And that's totally okay. And it's totally okay to change that down the line. Like, you don't need to feel stuck. You are allowed to grow and evolve. So don't feel like whatever you come up with today, you have to be married to forever. So I think that's really important tip to, if you take away anything from this short little episode, is that it is not set in stone. So I really hope this helps kind of talk through and think through some of the branding for your podcast. I would love to hear your intro and your music. I love listening to intros and I love listening to different types of music for podcasts. So be sure to follow me and tag me on Instagram, send me a DM, let me know what you're working on. And of course, if you have any questions, you can email me hello@carolinecreates.com. Again, thank you so much for listening, you guys. I do really, really appreciate that. my episode is allowed to pop up in your feed. And next week, I am going to be talking about planning content that your audience wants to hear. And how do you know what your audience wants to hear? And how can you plan content accordingly? And we will talk all about that. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I will see you next time. Before you go, please head to Apple Podcasts and leave me a review. I would love to hear from you. And to learn more about me and follow along my journey, head to www.carolinecreates.com. There you can also listen to episodes, watch YouTube videos, and find out more about my podcasting services. Thanks so much. Have a great day.